Have you ever been in a group situation, maybe a party where someone brings up the title of a book and everyone starts chiming in about how they love this book? And you're very uncomfortable, not saying a word because you figure you're probably the only person in the room that hates the book. So if this has happened to you, then you can understand and have sympathy for the way for the last 35 years I have reacted to Jane Eyre. Most people seem to think it's a romance, and I have always thought it was a tragedy. Now, recently, I've reread the book with a different process than I have before, and that process changed the way I feel about Jane Eyre, as well as changed me personally. And so today I want to talk to you about that process and how you could use that process to enrich your life when you read. What you read changes you for good or bad, no matter what your intentions are, whether you notice it or not. But when you read a classic with the intent to find true principles, and then you discuss with people who are just as interested in finding true principles, you can have a paradigm shift or an epiphany that can fundamentally change the way you think about things, the way you think about the world in your life. So, we're going to talk about, I'm going to give you a little overview of what Jane Eyre is about in case you haven't read the book. We're going to talk about stories and the healing power of stories. There's an author that is, his name is Daniel Taylor, and we're going to talk about two types of stories and how I feel Jane Eyre fits in those stories. We're going to talk about my moment of change, when this book really changed me. And then we're going to talk about the process and how the process was necessary for that change. So, Jane Eyre, what's it about? It is considered to be one of the greatest classics of all time. That's a pretty heavy title. It's about an orphan named Jane who is victimized over and over again, but she is never actually a victim. She's poor, she has nothing, no one loves her, but despite her humble circumstances, she has a strong sense of self. She knows right and wrong, good and bad, what is true and what is false. And she will choose the right every single time. Jane meets and falls in love with Rochester, who betrays her. And even though he begs her to stay, she knows that staying with him is wrong and she leaves him. She's literally starving in the streets, but the choice is between doing what's right or rationalizing doing what's wrong for love. Then she meets another man named St. John who also offers her marriage, but he does not offer her love. It's a marriage of convenience. And at this point in the book, you would probably not blame her for rationalizing to choose comfort, but she knows that love is an essential part of marriage, and so she turns St. John down also. So I've read this book. There's door number 1, Rochester, and there's door number 2, and that's St. John, and so I'm waiting for bachelor number 3 to show up. He never shows up, and at the end of the book, Jane makes a choice that I just cannot understand. I don't understand the purpose of this story. So, as I was saying, Daniel Taylor wrote a book called The Healing Power of Stories, and he has a type of story. So all the stories that we read fit under one of the categories that he talks about. And one of the categories is a broken story. That is where good things are represented as good, evil is represented as evil, but evil or bad wins. So I've watched Jane Eyre make all of these wonderful decisions. She's a wonderful role model. And then at the end, she goes back to Rochester. And I felt betrayed at the end of that book. I felt that even though he made one selfless act, that was not enough for her to forgive everything. And I felt like it was a broken book. I was listening to Oliver DeMille, who is the author of the Thomas Jefferson Education book. He's also the author of the tjed.org site, and he was doing a commentary on this book. And he talked about how this is actually a story of atonement, that Rochester sacrificed in that moment everything, and Jane, looking at him, saw him clearly. She knew his flaws. She knew what his problems were, and she chose to love him anyways. And so it's a story about atonement. And in that moment, my whole paradigm shift occurred. I felt a change, and it went from being a tragedy to a romance for me again. And it made me think of the fact that, yeah, what Rochester did, those would be like flaws. That would be a no-go for me. But my husband looked at me when we met and saw all of my flaws, and he chose me anyways. And it was not a deal breaker for him. And I felt so much gratitude. And I sat down with my life and I looked at how my relationship with my husband, and I made some changes because of this book. So that was my first paradigm shift. So the second one is that I had to have that process. I had to change the process. So I've read the book a number of times and never had my opinion change. I've superficially talked about the book with people and my opinion didn't change. But when I listened to someone else and talked with someone who had wisdom and who had really thought out the book, they helped me see it in a new way. My perspective changed. It changed and my world changed. So another story type is called a healing book. A third story type is a whole book. A whole book is where good is good, bad is bad, and good wins in the end. And I believe on the whole, Jane Eyre is a whole book. But for me, it's a healing book because for so long I looked at it as a broken book. And with a healing book, it can be good is good, bad is bad, bad wins, but it changes you in some way. So I was changed by this book, and so I call it a healing book for me personally. So we have talked about Jane Eyre. I gave you an overview of this book. We've talked about whether or not it was a healing story, the type of story that it was. We talked about my moment of change and how it changed me. And we talked about how important the process was for me to actually have that change. So now I'm very excited for my next party where someone brings up Jane Eyre and I can say, yes, it's a romance, but not because Jane Eyre has these two suitors and she has to choose between love and comfort. No, it's because Charlotte Bronte reminded me that because of the atonement of Jesus Christ, every minute of every day, people can change and we can choose to see them with all of their flaws and we can choose to love them anyways. And that is why we are here on this earth. So if you haven't read Jane Eyre, go read it. But whether you do or not, pick a classic, read it and try to find some true principles and talk to someone who is also on the same journey and then change. Thank you.